On April 26, 1986, the world witnessed what many believed to be humanity's worst nuclear disaster. Reactor 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Soviet Ukraine exploded, releasing massive amounts of radioactive material into the atmosphere. The official narrative painted a picture of immediate death, uninhabitable wastelands, and genetic mutations that would persist for millennia. But what if much of what you've been told about Chernobyl is fundamentally incorrect? What if the real story is far more complex, nuanced, and in some ways, even more disturbing than the simplified version presented in popular culture? The Chernobyl disaster has become a cultural phenomenon, inspiring television series, documentaries, books, and countless articles. Each retelling has added layers to mythology surrounding the event, creating a narrative that often prioritizes drama over accuracy. The HBO miniseries Chernobyl, while critically acclaimed and Emmy-winning, took significant creative liberties with the historical record. These dramatizations, combined with Cold War-era propaganda from both sides, have created a distorted understanding of what actually happened that fateful night and in the years that followed. The truth about Chernobyl is simultaneously less apocalyptic and more troubling than popular belief suggests. While the immediate death toll was far lower than many assume, the long-term health consequences remain hotly debated among scientists. The exclusion zone, far from being a lifeless wasteland, has become an unexpected nature reserve where wildlife thrives in ways that challenge our understanding of radiation's effects on living organisms. The reactor design flaws that caused the disaster were known to Soviet authorities years before the explosion, yet nothing was done to address them. This story examines 15 crucial aspects of the Chernobyl disaster that are commonly misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented. We'll explore the actual death toll versus the sensationalized figures reported in media. We'll investigate how the RBMK reactor's fundamental design problems were a disaster waiting to happen. We'll examine the true story of the Liquidators who cleaned up the disaster, separating fact from fiction. We'll look at the surprising recovery of wildlife in the exclusion zone and what it teaches us about radiation. And we'll confront uncomfortable truths about how both Soviet and Western authorities manipulated information about the disaster for political purposes. Understanding the real Chernobyl matters because the lessons learned continue to shape nuclear policy worldwide. The disaster influenced the development of safer reactor designs, improved international nuclear safety protocols, and changed how we think about technological risk. Yet if our understanding is based on myths rather than facts, we cannot properly learn from this tragedy. The victims of Chernobyl deserve an accurate accounting of what happened, not a sensationalized narrative that serves political or entertainment purposes. This is a true story of Chernobyl, a tale of engineering hubris, bureaucratic incompetence, extraordinary heroism, and unexpected scientific discoveries. It's a story that challenges assumptions about radiation, reveals the resilience of nature, and demonstrates both the best and worst of human behavior under extreme pressure. The reality is more complex than the myths, and understanding that complexity is essential for anyone who wants to comprehend one of the defining moments of the 20th century. Prepare to question everything you thought you knew about Chernobyl. Perhaps no aspect of Chernobyl is more misunderstood than the actual human cost of the disaster. Popular accounts often cite death tolls ranging from tens of thousands to nearly 1 million people. Documentaries have repeated these figures so often that they become accepted as fact. The reality, however, is far more complicated and significantly lower than these sensationalized numbers suggest. The immediate death toll from the Chernobyl disaster was remarkably small compared to popular belief. Only 2 plant workers died in the initial explosion itself. Over the following weeks and months, 28 firefighters and emergency responders died from acute radiation syndrome. These deaths were horrific and painful, make no mistake, but the total of 30 confirmed deaths directly attributable to the disaster is drastically different from the hundreds of thousands often claimed. The confusion about Chernobyl's death toll stems from attempts to calculate long-term cancer deaths attributable to radiation exposure. In 2005, the Chernobyl Forum, which included the World Health Organization, International Atomic Energy Agency, and other expert bodies, estimated that approximately 4,000 people might eventually die from radiation-related cancers among the most highly exposed groups. This figure covers the emergency workers from 1986 to 1987 evacuees, and residents of the most contaminated areas. However, even this higher estimate is far below the catastrophic figures often cited in media reports. Some organizations have proposed much higher death toll estimates, with Greenpeace suggesting up to 93,000 eventual cancer deaths. These dramatic differences arise from varying methodologies for calculating radiation exposure across populations and different models for how low-level radiation affects cancer risk. The linear no-threshold model, which assumes any radiation exposure increases cancer risk proportionally, produces higher estimates than alternative models. This scientific disagreement has been exploited by both sides of the nuclear power debate, with anti-nuclear advocates emphasizing higher estimates and nuclear industry supporters citing lower ones. What complicates the picture further is the difficulty of attributing specific cancers to Chernobyl radiation versus other causes. Cancer is common in all populations, and separating radiation-induced cancers from those that would have occurred anyway is scientifically challenging. The exception is thyroid cancer in children, where a clear increase was documented in contaminated areas, with approximately 5,000 cases identified, though most were successfully treated. Beyond the specific cancer type, establishing definitive causation for other cancers becomes progressively more difficult. The psychological and social toll of Chernobyl far exceeded the direct radiation deaths. The World Health Organization noted that the mental health impact of the disaster, including anxiety, depression, and stress-related illnesses, has been enormous and possibly represents the most significant public health consequence. Over 350,000 people were permanently evacuated from their homes, disrupting entire communities and causing lasting trauma. Many liquidators suffered from Chernobyl AIDS, a controversial diagnosis of immune system problems attributed to radiation exposure, though scientific consensus on this condition remains uncertain. The truth about Chernobyl's death toll is this. The immediate deaths were surprisingly few. The long-term cancer deaths are genuinely uncertain and likely number in the thousands rather than hundreds of thousands, and the psychological and social devastation was catastrophic. By focusing obsessively on inflated death tolls, we obscure the real lessons of Chernobyl: poor design, institutional failure, and the importance of transparency. The victims deserve accurate accounting, not exaggeration that serves political agendas. The reactor that exploded at Chernobyl was not just unfortunate. It was fundamentally flawed from its conception. The RBMK, Reactor Bolshoi Mashnosty Kanalny, Reactor represented Soviet engineering priorities that value production capacity and weapon-grade plutonium generation over safety. Understanding the RBMK's inherent design problems reveals that the Chernobyl disaster was not a freak accident, but an inevitable consequence of choosing economics and military needs over safety. The RBMK reactor was a graphite-moderated, water-cooled design that operated differently from the pressurized water reactors common in the West. Its most dangerous characteristic was a positive void coefficient, meaning that as water temperature increased and steam bubbles formed, nuclear reactivity increased rather than decreased. In Western reactor designs, the opposite occurs. Increased temperature reduces reactivity, creating an inherent safety mechanism. The RBMK's positive void coefficient meant that during certain conditions, the reactor could rapidly spiral out of control, exactly what happened on April 26, 1986. Soviet nuclear scientists were fully aware of this design flaw. Internal reports from the 1970s documented concerns about the positive void coefficient and the potential for reactivity accidents. However, the RBMK design had significant advantages for Soviet priorities. The reactor could be refueled while operating, maximizing electricity generation and plutonium production. It used unenriched uranium, which was cheaper and more readily available than the enriched uranium required by Western designs. Most importantly, the RBMK efficiently produced weapons-grade plutonium for the Soviet nuclear arsenal. The control rod design represented another catastrophic flaw. The RBMK's control rods had graphite tips that actually increased reactivity for the first few seconds after insertion before the neutron-absorbing material took effect. This design quirk was known as the positive scram effect. During the safety test that preceded the disaster, when operators attempted an emergency shutdown by inserting all control rods simultaneously, these graphite tips caused a massive, brief spike in reactivity that triggered the explosion. The very safety mechanism designed to shut down the reactor instead destroyed it. The RBMK also lacked a containment structure, a reinforced building designed to contain radioactive material in case of accident. Western reactor designs typically featured massive concrete containment domes that could withstand explosions and prevent radiation release. The RBMK had only a standard industrial building around it. Soviet designers considered the reactor so safe that expensive containment structures were deemed unnecessary. This decision proved catastrophic when the explosion occurred, allowing radioactive material to escape directly into the atmosphere. The reactor's size and complexity created additional problems. As one of the most powerful reactors in the world at the time, producing 1,000 megawatts of electricity, the RBMK contained enormous amounts of radioactive material. Its complexity, with 1,661 individual fuel channels, made it difficult to monitor and control. Operators needed sophisticated understanding of reactor physics to manage it safely, yet training was often inadequate. After Chernobyl, surviving RBMK reactors were retrofitted with safety improvements, including modified control rods, enhanced safety systems, and better operator training. However, the fundamental design flaws could not be completely eliminated. Several RBMK reactors continued operating until recently, with the last units at Kursk finally scheduled for decommissioning. The RBMK reactor stands as a testament to what happens when engineering decisions prioritize production over safety, when known design flaws are ignored for economic or political reasons. One of the most counterintuitive discoveries about Chernobyl is that the exclusion zone has become a thriving wildlife sanctuary. The 30-kilometer radius around the reactor, evacuated humans in 1986, now hosts populations of wolves, bears, lynx, wild boar, and even the endangered Przewalski's horse. This unexpected ecological recovery challenges fundamental assumptions about radiation's effects on living organisms and raises profound questions about what truly threatens biodiversity. Scientists initially predicted that the exclusion zone would remain essentially lifeless for decades or centuries. Radiation levels in some areas remain dangerously high, with soil contamination from cesium-137 and strontium-90 that will persist for generations. Early surveys seem to confirm these pessimistic predictions, finding reduced insect populations, genetic abnormalities in plants, and bird populations with higher mutation rates. Yet within just a few years, wildlife began returning in numbers that exceeded pre-disaster levels. Camera trap studies and aerial surveys revealed astonishing biodiversity in the exclusion zone. Gray wolf populations thrived at densities 7 times higher than in comparable nature reserves. European bison, once extinct in the region, were successfully reintroduced. Rare species like the European lynx and brown bear, absent from the region for decades before the disaster, returned and established breeding populations. The zone effectively became Europe's largest unintentional nature preserve, demonstrating that the absence of human activity could be more beneficial to wildlife than the presence of radiation was harmful. This phenomenon doesn't mean radiation is harmless. Researchers have documented genetic mutations, reduced lifespans, and higher rates of tumors in some animal populations. Birds in high radiation areas show elevated levels of developmental abnormalities. Individual organisms certainly suffer from radiation exposure. However, at the population level, these effects appear less significant than the benefits of human absence. Without hunting, habitat destruction, agriculture, or development, wildlife populations have flourished despite radiation's toll on individuals. Recent studies suggest some organisms may be adapting to radiation exposure. Research published in 2025 found evidence of genetic changes in Chernobyl wildlife that might represent adaptive responses to chronic radiation exposure. Frogs in highly contaminated ponds showed darker coloration, potentially increasing melanin production to protect against radiation. Fungi discovered growing inside the damaged reactor appeared to use melanin to convert radiation into chemical energy, similar to how plants use chlorophyll for photosynthesis. These findings suggest that life adapts to even extreme environmental challenges. The Chernobyl wildlife paradox offers crucial lessons for conservation biology. It demonstrates that human activity, not just pollution or contamination, represents the primary threat to many species. The exclusion zone's accidental success as a nature reserve has prompted calls to formally protect it as a wildlife sanctuary after radiation levels eventually decreased to safe levels. Some researchers argue the zone provides a unique laboratory for studying evolution adaptation and ecosystem recovery under extreme conditions. However, romanticizing Chernobyl's ecological recovery would be a mistake. The area remains dangerous to humans, and many organisms show clear negative effects from radiation. The ecosystem is not healthy in a conventional sense, but rather demonstrates nature's resilience and the relative impacts of different environmental stressors. The wildlife thriving in Chernobyl's shadow serves as both a testament to life's adaptability and a sobering reminder that humanity's everyday activities can harm ecosystems more than even nuclear disasters. This uncomfortable truth challenges us to reconsider our relationship with the natural world. The Liquidators represent both the greatest heroism and the darkest exploitation of the Chernobyl disaster. Between 1986 and 1990, approximately 600,000 to 800,000 Soviet citizens were sent to Chernobyl to contain the disaster, clean contaminated areas, and construct a sarcophagus over the destroyed reactor. Their stories have been simultaneously mythologized and forgotten, with the truth falling somewhere between the legends of selfless sacrifice and tales of forced labor. The immediate response required extraordinary courage. Firefighters who responded to the initial explosion had no idea they were facing a nuclear disaster rather than a conventional fire. They battled graphite fires on a reactor roof without protective equipment, exposed to radiation levels thousands of times higher than safe limits. Many of these first responders died within weeks from acute radiation syndrome. Their sacrifice prevented an even worse disaster, but they were sent into lethal conditions through a combination of ignorance and deception by authorities who knew the true danger. The later liquidators faced different circumstances. By mid-1986, authorities understood the radiation threat, yet hundreds of thousands were still sent to work in contaminated areas. Some were military personnel ordered to participate. Others were civilian volunteers enticed by promises of higher pay, better housing, or preferential treatment. Many were told their exposure would be brief and safe when authorities knew otherwise. The most dangerous work, including clearing radioactive graphite from the reactor roof, was accomplished by biorobots, men who worked in 90-second shifts because radiation levels destroyed even military robots. Liquidators came from across the Soviet Union, representing every republic and ethnicity. They built the original sarcophagus, a hastily constructed steel and concrete shell over the destroyed reactor. They buried contaminated villages, forests, and equipment. They washed radioactive dust from buildings in Pripyat and surrounding towns. They constructed new roads, built monitoring stations, and established the exclusion zone's infrastructure. This massive undertaking prevented further contamination spread and allowed some areas to eventually be reoccupied. The health consequences for liquidators varied enormously depending on when and where they worked. Early liquidators received significantly higher doses than those who arrived later. Workers who entered the reactor building or cleared the roof faced extreme exposure, while those who worked in less contaminated areas received relatively modest doses. Soviet authorities kept inadequate exposure records, making it difficult to correlate health problems with actual radiation doses. This record-keeping failure has hampered efforts to understand long-term radiation effects and provide appropriate medical care. Post-Soviet studies of liquidator health show mixed results. Some studies found increased rates of leukemia, thyroid cancer, and other radiation-related illnesses. Others found psychological trauma, depression, and stress-related conditions more prevalent than radiation-specific diseases. Many liquidators feel forgotten and abandoned by successive governments unable or unwilling to provide promised benefits and medical care. They organize associations to support each other, preserve their history, and advocate for recognition and assistance. The liquidators' legacy is complex. They prevented a worse catastrophe through genuine heroism, yet were often exploited by a system that valued expediency over human welfare. They deserve recognition as heroes, but also as victims of a government that sent them into danger without adequate protection or honest information. Their story embodies Chernobyl's central tragedy: individual courage and sacrifice responding to institutional failure and incompetence. Remembering the Liquidators means acknowledging both their heroism and the injustice they suffered. One of the most damning aspects of the Soviet response to Chernobyl was a delay in evacuating nearby Pripyat. The reactor exploded at 1:23 a.m. on April 26, 1986, yet evacuation of the city's 49,000 residents didn't begin until 2 p.m. on April 27th, more than 36 hours later. During this delay, residents went about their normal lives. Children played outside, and people absorbed radiation doses that would have been significantly reduced by immediate evacuation. This delay exemplifies how bureaucratic inertia and political concerns overrode public safety. The explosion was immediately visible and audible to Pripyat residents. Many went to the railway bridge to watch the beautiful blue ionization glow from the exposed reactor core. This bridge later became known as the Bridge of Death because observers had received lethal radiation doses, though the specific claim remains disputed. Despite the visible fire and obvious disaster, authorities told residents nothing was seriously wrong. Pripyat schools, shops, and workplaces operated normally on April 26, even as radiation levels soared. Soviet officials knew immediately that a catastrophic release had occurred. Military radiation monitoring equipment recorded off-scale readings within hours of the explosion. Moscow was informed of a major accident by early morning. Yet the decision to evacuate required navigating Soviet bureaucracy, where no local official wanted to take responsibility for such a dramatic action without explicit orders from higher authorities. The Politburo needed to convene, experts needed to be consulted, and evacuation plans needed to be drafted and approved, all while radioactive material poured into the atmosphere. When evacuation finally occurred, it was presented as temporary. Residents were told to bring only necessary items for 3 days. They left behind pets, possessions, and entire lives. Most never returned. The deception was deliberate, designed to prevent panic and ensure orderly evacuation. Yet it also meant people didn't take documents, valuables, or even photographs that could never be recovered. The psychological trauma of leaving everything behind, believing it temporary, then learning you could never return, compounded the disaster's human cost. The evacuation zone gradually expanded as authorities recognized the contamination's extent. On April 27th, they evacuated Pripyat's 10-kilometer radius. By early May, this expanded to 30 kilometers. Eventually, over 350,000 people from Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine were permanently relocated. Each expansion represented an admission that previous measures were inadequate, eroding public trust in official pronouncements. The delay had concrete health consequences. Children who played outside on April 26th absorbed radioactive iodine that concentrated in their thyroid glands. Many of the 5,000 thyroid cancer cases documented in subsequent years resulted from exposure during this delay. Had evacuation occurred within hours, or had authorities at least ordered people to stay indoors and take iodine tablets, much of this damage could have been prevented. The evacuation delay epitomizes the Soviet system's failings. A government that valued control and order over human welfare created a situation where officials feared taking initiative more than they feared radiation. The same system that achieved impressive feats of engineering and science, proving capable of rapid, honest response to disaster. The 36-hour delay wasn't caused by lack of knowledge or technical capability, but by political culture that punished decisive action and rewarded waiting for orders. This institutional paralysis killed and injured far more people than the explosion itself. The world learned about Chernobyl not from Soviet announcements, but from Swedish radiation monitors. On April 28, 1986, workers at the Forsmark nuclear power plant in Sweden, over 1,100 kilometers from Chernobyl, detected heightened radiation levels on their clothing. Initially fearing their own reactor had leaked, they soon determined the radiation was coming from outside, carried by winds from the southeast. Swedish scientists quickly calculated that a major nuclear accident had occurred in the Soviet Union. Only then, faced with irrefutable international evidence, did Soviet authorities acknowledge the disaster. The Soviet Union's initial response was complete denial. Despite the explosion occurring on April 26th, Soviet media reported nothing for nearly 2 days. The government's first acknowledgement came in a terse, 22nd announcement on April 28th evening news, stating only that an accident had occurred at Chernobyl and help was being given to victims. This minimal disclosure came only after Swedish and Finnish measurements made concealment impossible. Had the radiation plume traveled in a different direction, away from Western monitoring stations, the cover-up might have continued much longer. The delayed announcement had international consequences. Radiation from Chernobyl spread across Europe, contaminating farmland, water supplies, and food chains. Countries scrambled to implement protective measures, destroying contaminated crops, banning milk sales, and advising people to stay indoors. These responses would have been more effective with earlier warning. Poland, for instance, immediately distributed iodine tablets to children when they detected the radiation, significantly reducing thyroid exposure. Other countries lacked time to implement similar protections due to Soviet delays. Western governments and media used Chernobyl for propaganda purposes. Anti-nuclear activists exaggerated the disaster's scope to support their cause. Pro-nuclear advocates downplayed it. Cold War politics ensured that objective assessment was nearly impossible in 1986. Western media published wildly varying death toll estimates, some claiming thousands had already died when the actual number was dozens. Soviet counterpropaganda accused the West of exaggeration and Russophobia. The truth became a casualty of political agendas on both sides. The Soviet government's credibility never recovered from the Chernobyl cover-up. Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost, openness, policy, introduced the previous year, was exposed as hollow. Citizens who had cautiously believed in reform realized the government would still lie about matters of life and death. This erosion of trust accelerated the Soviet Union's collapse just 5 years later. Historians consider Chernobyl a major factor in the Soviet system's delegitimization. The international response to Chernobyl established important precedents. The International Atomic Energy Agency strengthened its monitoring and reporting protocols. The Convention on Early Notification of a Nuclear Accident, adopted later in 1986, required countries to immediately report accidents with potential transboundary radiation effects. These reforms directly address Chernobyl's cover-up, though compliance depends on governmental honesty. The cover-up teaches uncomfortable lessons about governmental transparency during disasters. Authorities worldwide, not just the Soviet Union, have shown troubling tendencies to minimize, delay, or obscure information about nuclear accidents. The instinct to avoid panic, protect political interests, or maintain control consistently trumps public right to know. Chernobyl demonstrated that in the nuclear age, such deception is both immoral and impractical, as radiation respects no borders and monitoring technology makes concealment increasingly difficult. Yet the lesson seems imperfectly learned, with subsequent nuclear incidents also featuring delayed disclosures and official minimization. One of the most crucial yet underappreciated moments in the Chernobyl disaster involved 3 men who volunteered to drain water from beneath the destroyed reactor. In the days following the explosion, authorities realized a molten reactor core was burning to the floor, heading toward massive water pools below the reactor. If the 1,200-ton mass of corium molten nuclear fuel reached these pools, it would trigger a massive steam explosion that could destroy the remaining 3 reactors and render much of Europe uninhabitable. 3 plant workers, Alexei Ananenko, Valery Bespalov, and Boris Baranov, volunteered to enter the flooded basement and open drainage valves to empty the pools. The mission seemed impossible. The basement was flooded, dark, and filled with radioactive debris. The men would have to navigate by flashlight through contaminated water to locate the correct valves. Radiation levels in the area were extraordinarily high, guaranteeing severe exposure. Plant engineers estimated the 3 men would die within days from acute radiation sickness. Yet, without their intervention, the steam explosion could kill millions and contaminate a significant portion of Europe. The 3 men entered the basement on May 4th, 1986. They wore wetsuits that provided minimal radiation protection. 2 men swam through the dark, radioactive water, while the 3rd held a lamp to guide them. They successfully located and opened the drainage valves, allowing the water to empty before the corium mass could reach it. The mission took approximately 20 minutes. When they emerged, Radiation monitors measured their exposure at levels that should have been lethal. Contrary to popular belief in dramatic retellings, all three men survived. While they certainly received significant radiation doses, they did not die within days or even weeks. Ananenko and Bespalov continued working in the nuclear industry for years afterward. Baranov died in 2005, but from a heart condition unrelated to radiation exposure at age 76. The other two were still alive decades later. Their survival challenges some of the more apocalyptic narratives about radiation exposure, while taking nothing away from their extraordinary courage. The dramatized version of this event, particularly in the HBO series, embellished certain details. The show depicted the mission as an immediate suicide, with the men dying shortly after. It portrayed the basement as completely pitch black, when in reality some emergency lighting still functioned. These dramatic enhancements made for compelling television, but obscured the real story. The truth that these men survived doesn't diminish their heroism. They believed they were accepting certain death to save others, which defines the highest form of courage. The steam explosion they prevented would have been catastrophic. Soviet scientists estimated it could have had a force of 3 to 5 megatons, equivalent to a nuclear weapon. While these estimates may have been exaggerated, even a conventional steam explosion in the reactor building would have destroyed containment efforts, spread far more contamination, and potentially damaged the other 3 operating reactors. The consequences would have multiplied the disaster several times over. The bubbler pool mission exemplifies Chernobyl's central paradox: individual heroism responding to institutional failure. The RBMK design created a situation where such desperate measures became necessary. The bureaucratic dysfunction delayed evacuation and proper response. Yet when crisis demanded action, ordinary workers stepped forward with extraordinary courage. These 3 men saved countless lives and prevented a disaster that would have made Chernobyl's actual consequences seem minor. Their story deserves to be told accurately, celebrating their courage without embellishment. Among Chernobyl's most documented and heartbreaking consequences is the epidemic of thyroid cancer in children exposed to radioactive iodine. In the years following the disaster, approximately 5,000 children and adolescents in Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia developed thyroid cancer, a disease previously rare in young people. The surgical scars these survivors bear became known as Chernobyl necklaces, a permanent reminder of the disaster's human cost. This health crisis represents one of the clearest radiation-related effects of the disaster and offers important lessons about nuclear accident response. Radioactive iodine, 131, was among the most significant isotopes released during the Chernobyl explosion. With a half-life of only 8 days, I-131 is dangerous for a relatively short period but concentrates rapidly in the thyroid gland, especially in children whose thyroids are more active and absorb iodine more readily. The contamination spread across Belarus, Ukraine, and western Russia, contaminating grass, which was eaten by cows, concentrating the iodine in milk. Children who drank contaminated milk absorbed massive doses of radioactive iodine directly to their thyroid glands. The evacuation delay and lack of information distribution made this crisis worse. Had authorities immediately distributed stable potassium iodide tablets, children's thyroid glands would have been saturated with non-radioactive iodine, preventing absorption of the radioactive isotope. Poland implemented exactly this response when they detected Chernobyl radiation, significantly reducing thyroid exposure in Polish children. Soviet authorities had iodine tablets stockpiled but failed to distribute them promptly, partly due to evacuation delays, and partly from concerns about causing panic. The thyroid cancer epidemic began appearing about 4 to 5 years after the disaster. Normally, thyroid cancer is extremely rare in children, with background rates of fewer than 1 case per million children annually. In contaminated areas of Belarus, rates reached 50 to 100 cases per million. The increase was statistically overwhelming and directly traceable to Chernobyl radiation. Unlike many other radiation health effects, where causation remains debated, the thyroid cancer connection is scientifically established. Most young thyroid cancer victims survived. Thyroid cancer, while serious, is among the more treatable cancers, especially when detected early. Medical teams from around the world provided treatment and support. Survival rates exceeded 95%. However, survivors required lifelong thyroid hormone replacement therapy and faced ongoing health monitoring. The psychological impact of cancer diagnosis and treatment during childhood or adolescence created lasting trauma. The Chernobyl thyroid cancer epidemic provided crucial data for understanding radiation health effects. Previously, most radiation health data came from Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors who received acute, high-dose external radiation. Chernobyl victims received chronic, lower-dose internal radiation from ingested radioisotopes. Studying these cases improved scientific understanding of radiation-induced cancer and influenced radiation protection standards worldwide. The epidemic raises disturbing questions about governmental responsibility. The thyroid cancer cases were largely preventable with prompt iodine distribution and dietary restrictions. The failure to implement these basic protective measures, despite having both the knowledge and resources, represent a betrayal of public health responsibilities. Parents who gave their children milk they believed safe, who followed official assurances that everything was fine, watched those children develop cancer years later. The Chernobyl necklace serves as a visible reminder of the disaster's lasting human impact. While anti-nuclear activists sometimes exaggerate Chernobyl's health effects and nuclear advocates minimize them, the thyroid cancer epidemic stands as incontrovertible evidence of radiation's harm. These 5,000 cases represent real children who suffered because authorities prioritized secrecy and order over health and safety. Their scars tell a truth that no amount of political manipulation can obscure. Deep within the ruins of Chernobyl's reactor lies what might be the most dangerous object ever created by humans, a mass of solidified radioactive lava known as the elephant's foot, formed when molten nuclear fuel mixed with concrete, sand, and metal during the meltdown. This 2-ton mass emitted radiation so intense that just 5 minutes of exposure in its presence in 1986 would deliver a lethal dose. The elephant's foot represents the terrifying reality of a nuclear meltdown and the extreme hazards that persisted long after the explosion. When Reactor 4 exploded, approximately 190 tons of nuclear fuel melted. Temperatures exceeded 2,000 degrees Celsius. This molten corium burned to the reactor floor, mixing with everything in its path: steel reinforcement, concrete, sand used as fire suppressant, and other reactor components. As it flowed through the building, the mixture solidified in grotesque formations. The largest and most infamous of these formations was discovered in December 1986 in a basement corridor beneath the reactor. The elephant's foot got its name from its shape and texture. The solidified mass resembles a frozen waterfall or melted wax, with a wrinkled, foot-like appearance. Its composition is unique to nuclear disasters. A combination of uranium, zirconium, silicon compounds, and other materials fused into a new, highly radioactive substance. Scientists studying it coined the term corium to describe this material that only exists after nuclear meltdowns. Initial radiation measurements of the elephant's foot were almost incomprehensible. In 1986, it emitted approximately 10,000 roentgens per hour. For context, 500 roentgens over 5 hours is lethal for humans. Standing next to the elephant's foot for 2 minutes would cause severe radiation sickness within hours. 5 minutes would be fatal within days. Even photographing it initially required extreme measures. Cameras sent on wheel carts with remote triggers, as even brief exposure damaged electronic equipment and film. The most famous photograph of the elephant's foot shows a man standing near it, seemingly close enough to touch. This image circulates with claims that a photographer died shortly after from radiation exposure. The truth is more complex. The photograph was taken in 1996, 10 years after formation, when radiation levels had decreased significantly due to radioactive decay. The photographer, Artur Korniev, survived and continued working at Chernobyl for many years. He received a significant radiation dose, but not an immediately lethal one. The image's apparent clarity is deceiving. Radiation interference created a grainy, streaked appearance. Over decades, the elephant's foot's radioactivity has decreased substantially through natural decay. By 2016, 30 years after formation, radiation levels had dropped to approximately 1/10 of original intensity. While still dangerous, it no longer delivers instantly lethal doses. However, it will remain hazardous for thousands of years as long-lived isotopes continue decaying. The elephant's foot poses ongoing challenges for Chernobyl's eventual decommissioning. Eventually, this and other corium formations must be removed and safely stored. Current technology cannot accomplish this task. The new safe confinement, completed in 2016, buys time by sealing the reactor building for approximately 100 years. Future generations will need to develop methods to safely handle these deadly remnants. The elephant's foot serves as a physical manifestation of nuclear power's dangers. Unlike abstract radiation measurements or distant health effects, this solid, visible object embodies what happens when nuclear technology fails catastrophically. It will outlive everyone who created it, remaining deadly long after the last person who remembers Chernobyl has died. Valery Legasov, the chief Soviet scientific investigator of the Chernobyl disaster, paid the ultimate price for attempting to tell the truth about what happened. A brilliant nuclear physicist and chemist, Legasov was appointed to the government commission investigating the accident. His technical expertise was crucial in understanding the disaster and preventing further contamination. Yet his insistence on identifying systemic problems in Soviet nuclear design and safety culture led to his professional destruction, and many believe, contributed to his suicide exactly 2 years after the disaster. Legasov arrived at Chernobyl on April 26th, hours after the explosion. He immediately grasped the severity of the situation, recognizing that the reactor core was exposed and burning. He proposed dropping sand, boron, lead, and other materials from helicopters to smother the fire and absorb radiation. This dangerous operation continued for days, with helicopter crews exposed to intense radiation. Legasov also identified the risk of the steam explosion from the basement pools, leading to the mission to drain them. In August 1986, Legasov represented the Soviet Union at the International Atomic Energy Agency conference in Vienna, presenting the first detailed account of the disaster. His presentation was technical, thorough, and remarkably candid by Soviet standards. He acknowledged serious problems with reactor operation and safety systems. International scientists praised his honesty and scientific rigor. However, Legasov stopped short of criticizing the RBMK reactor's fundamental design flaws, following political pressure from Soviet authorities. After Vienna, Legasov became increasingly troubled by the official narrative that blamed operator error exclusively while ignoring design problems. He began privately documenting systemic issues with Soviet nuclear program, inadequate safety culture, design flaws known but not addressed, insufficient operator training, and bureaucratic resistance to criticism. He attempted to have these concerns officially recognized, but was blocked by officials protecting their careers and the nuclear industry's reputation. Legasov's professional standing deteriorated rapidly. Despite his crucial role in managing the disaster, he was denied membership in the Soviet Academy of Sciences, a prestigious recognition many expected him to receive. Colleagues began avoiding him. Research funding dried up. He found himself marginalized within the scientific establishment he had served faithfully for decades. The implicit message was clear. Honesty about Chernobyl's causes came at unacceptable professional cost. On April 26, 1988, exactly 2 years after the disaster, Valery Legasov hanged himself in his apartment. He left behind audio tapes recorded in the months before his death, detailing the true causes of the Chernobyl disaster and the systemic problems he'd been prevented from addressing officially. These tapes, eventually transcribed and published, provided crucial insights into the disaster's causes and the Soviet system's failures. They vindicated Legasov's warnings about nuclear safety culture. Legasov's suicide was ruled a result of depression and health problems from radiation exposure. However, many colleagues and historians believe his professional isolation and frustration at being silenced contributed significantly. He had tried to serve both truth and state, discovering they were incompatible. His death represented the Soviet system's ultimate betrayal of one of its most dedicated servants. The HBO series Chernobyl prominently featured Legasov, portrayed as a hero fighting bureaucratic obstruction. While the series took dramatic liberties, it accurately captured his essential dilemma, a scientist whose integrity demanded truth-telling in a system that punished honesty. Legasov's legacy endures in the reforms his tapes eventually inspired and in the recognition that technological disasters result from institutional failures as much as technical ones. He paid with his life for insights the world needed to hear. Pripyat stands as one of the most haunting ghost towns on Earth, a Soviet city of 49,000 people evacuated in a single afternoon and never reoccupied. Founded in 1970 to house workers from the nearby Chernobyl nuclear power plant, Pripyat represented Soviet modernity at its peak. Well-planned, relatively prosperous, with amenities many Soviet cities lacked. The city's abandonment transformed into an accidental time capsule of Soviet life in the 1980s. Frozen at the moment of disaster, Pripyat was designed as a model Soviet city. Wide boulevards, modern apartment blocks, abundant green spaces, and impressive public facilities made it attractive to young workers and engineers. The city featured a cultural palace, 15 kindergartens, 5 schools, 2 hospitals, and numerous shops. The famous Pripyat amusement park, with iconic yellow Ferris wheel, was scheduled to open on May 1, 1986, for May Day celebrations. Instead, it opened briefly on April 27th to distract residents from the disaster before permanent evacuation. The evacuation on April 27th was supposed to be temporary. Residents were told to bring only essential documents and enough supplies for 3 days. Over 1,200 buses arrived to transport the entire population to safety in just 3 hours. People left behind pets, photographs, valuables, and entire lives, believing they would return soon. Dinner tables were left set, children's toys abandoned mid-play, books opened to pages never turned again. When authorities determined the city couldn't be reoccupied, these abandoned possessions became frozen evidence of interrupted lives. The city's rapid abandonment created eerie scenes that have made Pripyat a dark tourism destination. The amusement park, never officially opened, stands with its Ferris wheel rusting, but still recognizable. Schools contain lessons written on blackboards for April 26, 1986. A swimming pool, remarkably clean due to lack of organic contamination, reflects decaying buildings. The city's propaganda slogans about Soviet progress and nuclear power's bright future now read as bitter irony. Nature has aggressively reclaimed Pripyat. Trees grow through building roofs, pushing aside concrete and asphalt. Vegetation covers streets and squares once meticulously maintained. Wildlife has moved into buildings, with birds nesting in abandoned apartments and wild animals roaming freely. The city has become an unexpected laboratory for studying how nature recovers urban spaces. Ecologists study the greening of Pripyat to understand ecological succession in human-free environments. Radiation levels in Pripyat vary considerably. Most outdoor areas now have relatively modest contamination, allowing brief supervised visits. However, certain spots remain dangerous. The Red Forest area, some buildings, and items that concentrated radioactive particles. Visitors can tour parts of the city with guides, though they're monitored for radiation exposure and must follow strict safety protocols. The tourism is controversial, with some viewing it as educational while others see it as exploitation tragedy. Pripyat has become a powerful symbol in popular culture. It appears in video games, films, novels, and art as shorthand for a post-apocalyptic abandonment. The contrast between Soviet optimism frozen in time and nature's reclamation creates powerful imagery about civilization's impermanence. However, this aestheticization sometimes obscures the human tragedy. Tens of thousands displaced, lives disrupted, a community destroyed. The city remains a warning and a memorial. It demonstrates how quickly human society can vanish when disaster strikes. The abandoned buildings, still structurally sound decades later, prove civilizations can fail long before their physical structures decay. Pripyat stands as testament to Chernobyl's enduring impact, a city that will likely remain abandoned for centuries, a permanent scar on the landscape, and reminder of April 26, 1986. The weeks following the Chernobyl explosion saw one of history's most extraordinary emergency responses as thousands fought to contain an invisible, deadly enemy. The Battle of Chernobyl, as it became known, involved helicopter pilots dropping materials onto the burning reactor, miners digging beneath it to prevent groundwater contamination, and engineers constructing a massive sarcophagus over the ruins. This desperate struggle demonstrated both remarkable human courage and the terrifying power of nuclear disasters. The first phase involved smothering the reactor fire. For 10 days, military and civilian helicopter crews made over 1,800 flights directly over the exposed reactor core, dropping approximately 5,000 tons of sand, boron, lead, clay, and other materials. Pilots endured extreme radiation exposure, with helicopter instruments failing due to radiation interference and crews becoming ill from acute exposure. The operation was extraordinarily dangerous, with one helicopter crashing after its rotor struck a construction crane cable, killing the 4 crew members. Concerns about groundwater contamination prompted a remarkable engineering project. Scientists feared the molten core would burn to the reactor foundation and reach groundwater, potentially contaminating the Pripyat River and ultimately the Dnieper River, which supplied drinking water to millions. The solution? Dig a tunnel beneath the reactor and construct a cooling platform. Over 400 coal miners from across the Soviet Union were recruited for this task. They worked in shifts, digging in temperatures exceeding 50 degrees Celsius in highly contaminated conditions. The miners completed their tunnel and refrigeration platform in just over a month. The heroism of these men parallels that of the liquidators on the roof. They worked knowing radiation exposure was likely, yet continued because failure could mean disaster for millions. Many miners developed health problems later attributed to their Chernobyl service. The refrigeration system was ultimately never activated. The core didn't penetrate as deeply as feared, and the cooling platform served primarily to reinforce the foundation for the sarcophagus that would follow. Construction of the sarcophagus represented the battle's final, massive phase. Engineers had to design and build a structure to contain the destroyed reactor and its radioactive contents without being able to perform normal surveys or spend extended time near the building due to radiation. The solution was a massive steel and concrete shell erected using cranes and remote construction techniques. Over 400,000 cubic meters of concrete and 7,000 tons of steel framework were used. The sarcophagus was completed in November 1986, less than 7 months after the disaster. This extraordinarily rapid construction came at significant cost to workers' health and safety. The structure was always intended as temporary, designed to last perhaps 30 years. It was completed so hastily that it contained numerous gaps and structural weaknesses. Radiation continued leaking from the sarcophagus, and its eventual collapse posed serious risks. By 2016, the original sarcophagus was deteriorating badly. The new safe confinement, a massive arch structure, was constructed adjacent to Reactor and slid into place over both the reactor and the original sarcophagus. This new structure, one of the largest movable land-based structures ever built, is designed to last 100 years and allow eventual dismantling of the reactor. It represents a second battle of Chernobyl, fought with modern engineering rather than desperate improvisation. The Battle of Chernobyl prevented a far worse catastrophe. Without the helicopter drops, the reactor fire might have spread to the other 3 reactors. Without draining the basement pools, a steam explosion could have devastated the region. Without the sarcophagus, radiation would have continued spreading unchecked. The battle's heroes, from helicopter pilots to miners to construction workers, saved countless lives through actions that damaged or shortened their own. Chernobyl has spawned countless myths about radiation's effects, many of which persist despite contradicting scientific evidence. Popular culture depicts radiation creating monsters, destroying all life instantly, and contaminating areas permanently beyond any redemption. While radiation is genuinely dangerous, the reality is more nuanced than these dramatic portrayals suggest. Understanding what radiation actually does versus what people fear it does is essential for learning Chernobyl's real lessons. One persistent myth claims that Chernobyl's exclusion zone will remain uninhabitable for 20,000 years or more. This figure is based on the half-life of plutonium-239, one of the radioactive isotopes present at Chernobyl. However, half-life doesn't directly translate to habitability. Many areas within the exclusion zone already have radiation levels low enough for human occupation. The primary long-term contamination concern involves cesium-137 and strontium-90, which have 30-year half-lives. Significant portions of the exclusion zone could be safely reoccupied within decades, not millennia. Another common myth involves grotesque mutations and deformities. Popular culture depicts Chernobyl creating monsters, giant animals, severely deformed humans, and nightmarish creatures. The reality is far less dramatic. While genetic mutations do occur in Chernobyl's wildlife, they rarely produce visible monsters. Most radiation-induced mutations are harmful at the cellular level, causing cancers or reproductive problems rather than creating Hollywood-style mutants. Studies of children born to Chernobyl liquidators found no statistically significant increase in genetic abnormalities. The myth of instant death upon entering contaminated areas persists despite evidence. While certain spots like the reactor building basement in 1986 were instantly lethal, most of the exclusion zone never approached such extreme radiation levels. Thousands of workers spent time in contaminated areas during cleanup operations. While they face increased health risks, they didn't immediately die or develop acute radiation syndrome. Even today, tour guides work regularly in parts of Pripyat without suffering immediate health effects. Some people believe everything from Chernobyl remains lethally radioactive forever. This leads to fears about contaminated food product from Ukraine or Belarus decades after the disaster. In reality, radiation levels in most affected areas have decreased dramatically through radioactive decay and environmental dispersion. Food produced in formerly contaminated areas is regularly tested and generally falls well within safe limits. The exception involves certain concentrated sources like mushrooms and berries, which can accumulate cesium from soil. Conversely, some myths minimize radiation dangers. Nuclear industry advocates sometimes cite Chernobyl wildlife recovery to argue radiation is essentially harmless. This interpretation misreads the evidence. Wildlife thrives not because radiation is harmless, but because human absence benefits them more than radiation harms them at population levels. Individual animals show clear negative effects from radiation exposure. The lesson isn't that radiation is safe, but rather that human activity is extraordinarily damaging to ecosystems. The myth that vodka prevents radiation poisoning appeared during and after the disaster. This dangerous misconception likely arose from alcohol's actual medical use. Ethanol is treatment for methanol poisoning, combined with cultural factors. Vodka provides zero protection against radiation. The real prophylactic for radioactive iodine exposure is potassium iodide tablets, which should have been distributed immediately after the disaster. Understanding radiation scientifically rather than mythologically is crucial for rational nuclear policy. Exaggerating radiation dangers leads to counterproductive policies, while minimizing real risks endangers public health. Chernobyl's lessons require clear-eyed assessment of actual rather than imagined consequences. The truth is sobering enough without embellishment. Radiation causes real harm measurable in cancer deaths, genetic damage, and environmental contamination, but it's not the world-ending apocalypse weapon popular culture portrays. Beyond the human suffering and environmental damage, Chernobyl inflicted staggering economic costs that contributed to the Soviet Union's collapse. Estimates of the disaster's total economic impact range from $235 billion to over $700 billion in modern currency. These costs included immediate emergency response, long-term containment, medical care for victims, compensation to evacuees, lost economic productivity, and agricultural losses across contaminated regions. The economic burden proved unsustainable for an already struggling Soviet economy. The immediate response costs were enormous. The Battle of Chernobyl required mobilizing hundreds of thousands of workers, massive amounts of materials, and specialized equipment. Helicopter operations, the original sarcophagus instruction, and liquidator deployment cost billions of rubles. The Soviet government had to pay these costs while simultaneously managing evacuations, providing temporary housing for displaced populations, and establishing the exclusion zone's infrastructure. Agricultural losses extended across multiple countries. Contamination affected farming across Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and parts of Western Europe. Millions of hectares of farmland were taken out of production. Contaminated crops and livestock had to be destroyed. Belarus, which received approximately 70% of Chernobyl's fallout despite the reactor being in Ukraine, suffered particularly severe agricultural impacts. The country lost approximately 20% of its agricultural land to contamination. Medical and social welfare costs proved catastrophic over time. The Soviet Union and its successor states had to provide health care for hundreds of thousands of affected people, liquidators, evacuees, and residents of contaminated areas. Disability pensions for liquidators alone became a massive budgetary burden. Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia continued spending billions annually on Chernobyl-related health care, monitoring, and social programs decades after the disaster. The lost economic productivity from 350,000 evacuated people represented a permanent drain. Pripyat alone lost 49,000 residents, including many highly skilled nuclear engineers and technicians. The exclusion zone contained not just a Chernobyl plant, but also agricultural land, industrial facilities, and infrastructure that could never be recovered. This productive capacity simply vanished from the Soviet economy. The energy sector impact extended beyond the destroyed reactor. Reactor 4 was permanently lost, but reactors 1, 2, and 3 at Chernobyl continued operating for years after disaster because Ukraine desperately needed the electricity. However, operating these reactors required extensive safety modifications and increased security costs. Reactor 2 shut down after a fire in 1991, Reactor 1 in 1996, and Reactor 3 finally closed in 2000. Each closure reduced Ukraine's power generation capacity. International assistance helped offset some costs but created dependencies. Western countries and international organizations provided billions in aid for Chernobyl cleanup, medical treatment, and a new safe confinement construction. While helpful, this assistance came with conditions and highlighted the affected country's inability to manage the disaster's consequences independently. The economic burden contributed significantly to the Soviet Union's collapse. Chernobyl occurred just as Mikhail Gorbachev was attempting economic reforms to revive the stagnating Soviet economy. The disaster diverted massive resources to emergency response and long-term management, exactly when the Soviet Union could least afford it. Some historians estimate Chernobyl accelerated the Soviet collapse by several years. For Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, Chernobyl's economic legacy persists. All three countries maintain government agencies dedicated to Chernobyl management, spending billions on exclusion zone maintenance, victim compensation, medical monitoring, and research. This ongoing cost, decades after the disaster, demonstrates that nuclear accidents create economic burdens spanning generations. The true cost of Chernobyl may never be fully calculated, as expenses continue accumulating with no clear end in sight. Chernobyl fundamentally transformed global nuclear policy, safety culture, and public perception of nuclear power. The disaster's ripple effects extended far beyond the Soviet Union, influencing reactor design, international cooperation, emergency preparedness, and energy policy worldwide. Understanding Chernobyl's legacy requires examining both the genuine safety improvements it inspired and the ongoing debates about nuclear power's role in humanity's future. Reactor design evolved significantly after Chernobyl. The RBMK's fundamental flaws became case studies in what not to do. New reactor designs incorporated passive safety features that work without human intervention or electrical power. The principle of defense in depth, multiple independent safety systems providing backup protection, became standard. Western reactor designs already embodied many of these principles, but Chernobyl accelerated their adoption and inspired improvements even in existing safety culture. International nuclear safety cooperation improved dramatically. Before Chernobyl, nuclear programs were often secretive national projects with limited information sharing. The disaster demonstrated that nuclear accidents respect no borders. This led to the Convention on Early Notification of a Nuclear Accident and the Convention on Assistance in Case of Nuclear Accident, both adopted in 1986. The International Atomic Energy Agency gained enhanced monitoring and coordination roles. The World Association of Nuclear Operators was founded to facilitate safety information exchange among reactor operators worldwide. Public opinion shifted decisively against nuclear power in many countries. Germany initiated a gradual nuclear phase-out that accelerated after Fukushima in 2011. Italy held a referendum that shut down its nuclear program. Austria, which had completed but never operated a nuclear plant, permanently abandoned nuclear power. Public fear of nuclear accidents, amplified by Chernobyl's dramatic imagery, created political environments where nuclear expansion became impossible in many democracies. Conversely, some countries doubled down on nuclear power with improved safety. France maintained its nuclear heavy energy strategy, though with enhanced safety protocols. China, India, and other developing nations continued building nuclear capacity, arguing that climate change posed greater risks than properly managed nuclear power. The debate between nuclear advocates and opponents intensified, with Chernobyl serving as both sides' primary evidence. Emergency preparedness protocols worldwide incorporated Chernobyl lessons. Distribution of iodine tablets to populations near nuclear facilities became standard practice in many countries. Evacuation planning improved. Communication strategies evolved to prioritize transparency over secrecy. These changes aimed to prevent the delays and cover-ups that worsened Chernobyl's health impacts. The exclusion zone became an unexpected resource for science. Researchers study radiation's long-term effects on ecosystems, evolutionary adaptations to radiation exposure, and ecological recovery in human-free environments. This research has applications beyond nuclear safety, informing conservation biology, evolution studies, and understanding of human environmental impacts. Chernobyl transformed from solely a disaster site into a unique natural laboratory. The disaster influenced climate change debates in complex ways. Nuclear advocates argue that Chernobyl, despite being history's worst nuclear accident, killed far fewer people than coal power kills annually through air pollution. They contend that nuclear power, properly managed, remains essential for reducing carbon emissions. Opponents counter that renewable energy offers safer alternatives. Chernobyl evidence serves both positions, depending on interpretation. Chernobyl's ultimate legacy may be demonstrating that technological disasters result from institutional failures more than technical problems. The RBMK's design flaws were known but unaddressed. Operators were inadequately trained. Safety culture prioritized production over caution. Government secrecy prevented timely protection of populations. These failures were preventable with proper institutions, regulations, and culture. The lesson extends beyond nuclear power to any complex, high-risk technology. Technical sophistication means nothing without institutional competence, transparent communication, and genuine commitment to safety over expediency. This insight, more than any specific technical change, represents Chernobyl's enduring contribution to how humanity manages dangerous technologies. The truth about Chernobyl is more complex, more nuanced, and more important than the myths that have surrounded it for decades. This disaster was not an unavoidable accident, but the predictable result of design flaws, institutional failures, and a political system that valued secrecy over safety. The heroes who prevented worse catastrophe deserve accurate recognition, not dramatized exaggeration. The victims deserve honest accounting of their suffering, not inflated death tolls that serve political agendas. Understanding Chernobyl correctly matters because humanity continues developing powerful technologies with catastrophic failure potential. The lessons about institutional transparency, safety culture, and honest communication apply far beyond nuclear power. Whether addressing climate change, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, or future innovations, we face choices about prioritizing safety versus production, transparency versus secrecy, and long-term responsibility versus short-term gain. If you found this deep dive into Chernobyl's truth valuable, subscribe to this channel for more documentary-style investigations into history's dark secrets and hidden truths. Hit the notification bell to never miss an upload. The truth matters, even when it's uncomfortable.